If you grew up in the golden era of JRPGs, there are a few names you may have heard of by now. Indeed, while there are some candidates from elsewhere, most of the best examples of the genre can be traced back to a single company's output between 1995 and 2001, and that company was Squaresoft. Such a legendary era brought with it several key figures who would in many ways be responsible for defining the genre as we know it today. Two of these figures were Hideyoki Ito and Nobuo Uematsu. Ito, who had first joined Square in the late 80s to work as a debugger on Final Fantasy 1 and 2, would begin to move into a more design-focused role on Final Fantasy 3. However, it would be Final Fantasy 4 where he would make possibly his most long-standing mark on the genre. Before this, the series had used a full turn-based battle system. You had a turn, then your opponent did. Simple. However, in an attempt to make battles more exciting, Ito would create what has become known as the Active Time Battle, or ATB system. In this system, players would act in an order based on their stats, and enemies would not wait for the player to have finished their turn, lending much more urgency to proceedings and moving things closer to using real-time inputs without losing the magic of the old-school JRPG battle systems. This would revolutionize the genre in many ways, and would become the first JRPG combat system to be patented by Square. But Ito's achievements wouldn't stop at the ATB system. In the years following Final Fantasy IV, he would go on to be the lead battle designer for every mainline Final Fantasy game and Final Fantasy Tactics throughout Square's golden era, and would even take on the role of director for several of the series' best received entries, including Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy IX. Nobuo Uematsu would forge a similar legacy during his time at Square, as he would be responsible for creating the score for every mainline game in the series from its inception in 1987 until he left Square in 2004. Moreover, despite his departure, he has still consistently worked on the series' scores since, often in a supporting or freelance capacity. Such a body of work makes Uematsu one of the greatest composers to ever grace any entertainment medium, and he has also allowed for the elevation of gaming as an art form through his music. Flash forward to Tokyo Game Show 2021. After some other information and a few other reveals, Square drops the trailer for a new game no one's ever heard of. Dungeon Encounters would be the first game directed by Hideyoki Ito since he had taken over from Yasumi Matsuno to deliver Final Fantasy XII back in 2006, and the collective gasp from the JRPG community was almost audible. Couple this with the involvement of Uematsu, and many were ready to drop their cash right then and there. But then we saw the trailer. It didn't appear to be the traditional JRPG that the involvement of such key figures might suggest, and instead looked more like a systems-driven, stripped-back experience with little in the way of story. Still, fans would not have to wait long to find out, and the game would release on Switch, PC, and PS4 just 2 short weeks after its announcement at TGS. Having now played it, I can confirm that it is in many ways what the trailer suggests. A JRPG with the world, art direction, deep narrative, and character focus completely removed. So the question is, can a game like this, even one made by a master of his craft, succeed based purely on its systems and mechanics? To say that Dungeon Encounters has no story would not be completely accurate, but it wouldn't be far off. The game's entire narrative is delivered to the player in 2 short paragraphs when beginning a new adventure. It seems a mysterious labyrinth filled with all manner of horrors has appeared on the doorstep of a small and peaceful town. After sending in all their trained soldiers, only to have not a single one return, the townsfolk have taken it upon themselves to take up arms, train in the ways of war and magic, and venture into the depths of the mysterious structure. And that's it. That's all the story you're getting, I'm afraid. It's difficult to really critique this, as it was so clearly the intention. It may be a problem for many players that the game is so light on narrative, but such a setup does all it needs to facilitate the mechanics, and this was clearly the goal. Personally, while I often find the battle and progression systems important elements, I prefer my JRPGs much more story and character focused, but your mileage may vary. So if there's barely any story, what is there? Well, essentially, Dungeon Encounters, more than anything else, is a collection of battle and progression mechanics layered over a very basic dungeon crawling game. At the game's opening, you pick a party from a group of cadets and venture forth into floor after floor of tiled maps, which act as dungeon layouts. Each of these maps contains certain numbered tiles, which have various effects. The white numbered tiles are event tiles, and they will usually be of benefit to the player. Stuff like ascending or descending stairs to go up or down a floor, some bestiary information, a resurrection shrine, a healing fountain, or a new ability, or so on. The numbers are always the same for these as well, meaning if you come across, say, an 01 tile, you know that will be a staircase, for example. As you explore, you will chart tiles by running over them, which will unlock ability points. The way abilities work is that each one has a points value and can be equipped at ability stations. The catch is that your characters have an ability point total, which is subtracted from whenever one is equipped, meaning you sometimes have to choose what to prioritize and which abilities you might find most useful. Accompanying the white numbered tiles are black numbered tiles. These represent enemy encounters and lead us to the meat and potatoes of dungeon encounters, the combat and progression systems. Battles are turn-based and take place on a separate screen comprised of enemy and player portraits. Essentially, the way it works is all player characters and enemies have 3 points values: health points, magic defense, and physical defense. In order to defeat a foe, you must deplete their health points entirely. However, before doing so, you must first either deplete their physical or magical defense meter and then attack again with the corresponding attack type. This is done by either using magical or physical attacks, which are augmented and upgraded through leveling up, new gear, and new abilities. So, for example, in this fight, these enemies have very low HP, but much higher magical and physical defense respectively. These must therefore be depleted by using the corresponding attacks before any damage can be done to the enemy's HP. The information here tells you how much damage your character will do when using either a physical or magical attack, allowing for you to strategize. This value can be affected dramatically or even randomized depending on the equipment and skills being used. Also, both monsters and players have visible ATB gauges, so you'll know the turn order as the fight progresses. It's also worth noting that if you do more damage than is housed in one of these meters, the difference will be lost. So, say I hit this enemy for 100 magical damage. Even though his magic defense is way below that, I won't get the extra damage on his HP. I'll simply deplete his meter this turn and have to attack again on my next turn to damage his HP. Your team's magic defense and physical defense will replenish after every battle, however their HP will not. This is instead restored through the use of abilities or healing points found throughout the dungeon floors. Finally, on top of all of this, is the game's gear and equipment systems. Weapons, armor, and accessories can either be found as drops from enemies, discovered in certain locations in the labyrinth itself, or can be bought from shops on the first floor. Money is gained through exploration and defeat of enemies, meaning a gameplay loop is naturally created. Explore the floors, gain new abilities, kill enemies, gain money, buy gear, rinse and repeat. Much like abilities, each of the player characters has an equipment point value that increases with each level, and each piece of gear also has a number assigned. The player can then equip gear up to their gear allowance number, but not above, meaning that you might find a really powerful piece of gear that has a really high number, forcing you to unequip all your other armor and accessories in order to use it. Like all good battle systems, the basics here are easy to grasp, but new mechanics and factors are layered on top as the player progresses through more floors and encounters more foes. As expected from a developer known for his mechanical prowess, the systems on display here are really excellent and create a deceptively addictive gameplay loop that is both challenging and satisfying. However, as the journey goes on, there are a few problems with the game's overall design that begin to rear their head. Firstly, there are multiple status effects that can force the player to backtrack some distance to find a purification tile. This leads to some tedium, as you might expect, as retreading past floors and trying to remember where you last saw such a node can be more than a little frustrating. More than this though, there are some environmental hazards that are found later on in the game that can really spoil the fun. The best example of this is probably the hidden trapdoors. While these can simply lead to you falling through to the floor below, occasionally they can cause the party to be split up and lost in the labyrinth, forcing the player to start from the top and search them out if they don't want to start with a new party from scratch. The problem here is that such events can often be unavoidable, and it's easy to fall prey to such a trapdoor which has no outward signs of existence, or worse, no way of being detected by the player. Finally, while the combat and progression systems change and develop, the core moment-to-moment gameplay, when not in combat, doesn't really, besides seeing some growth in scale. This means that it's a great game to play for a while at the end of a long day, providing just enough pushback and satisfaction, but not demanding its player be completely engrossed. However, such a lack of demand regarding the player's levels of investment can lead to a general feeling of repetitiveness due to the lack of tangible narrative stakes. In terms of presentation, there's not much to talk about. The character portraits are nice, the UI is clean if a little uninspired, and the animations and dungeon designs are pretty much as functional as it gets. Really, what you're seeing in the footage is all you get, which again was clearly the intention, but is also probably a little too minimalist for some. In terms of music, what's here is good, but there really isn't a lot aside from the opening piece. Often floors simply have ambient noise like birds chirping or rainfall, meaning the score here is sparse and only used occasionally. There is a battle theme, but it's pretty generic and forgettable to be honest. Essentially, Uematsu's credit as musical director overseeing the soundtrack rather than the composer means that any expecting a full Uematsu score will likely be disappointed. Dungeon Encounters is a strange, curious, interesting, fun, and surprisingly deep offering from one of the grandfathers of the JRPG genre. Its battle and progression systems feel like the latest from a master of their craft and serve to elevate the game's gameplay loop above what might be expected going in. But the truth is that those other elements that make up the greats of the genre are truly missed here. And while the aforementioned systems do a lot to make the game fun, its lack of story, art style, characters, or diverse locations unfortunately hurts the experience. While all of this was clearly the intention, the renewed focus on combat and progression often made me wish that this battle system had been part of a more traditional JRPG. Having said that, there is still fun to be had here. Battles are intense and engaging, exploring is interesting, if occasionally frustrating, and the gameplay loop is deceptively addictive. If you fancy something a little different, or don't care much for story and setting in your JRPGs, then Dungeon Encounters might just be worth a look.